Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. I never imagined I'd find out my husband was living a double life. The kind of life I'd never seen in our suburban routine. We've been married for 5 years, and everything seemed perfect. He had a good job, and we had a lovely home. He was always attentive, loving, and supportive. But then, one night, something shifted. I was folding laundry, and a bright red lipstick stain caught my eye. It was on the collar of his favorite shirt, one he wore often, one I had never seen anyone else wear. My first instinct was to brush it off, but it wouldn't leave my mind. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I had overlooked it before, that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew that feeling, that gut-wrenching, undeniable feeling that something was wrong. That night, I casually asked him about it, as if it were just another day. "Did you get lipstick on your shirt?" I said it nonchalantly, trying not to sound accusing, trying to keep my voice steady. He chuckled, an easy laugh that I had heard 1,000 times before. "Oh, it's nothing," he replied, brushing it off with a wave of his hand. "Some colleague gave me a hug goodbye today. It's nothing, really." I wanted to believe him. I really did. After all, we had built a life together. But something about the way he said it, the way his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine, made my heart race with suspicion. The words felt rehearsed, like a story he had been telling himself for months. Maybe I was overthinking it, but I had never seen a lipstick mark that read on anyone other than someone who had been kissed. And why hadn't he mentioned it before? He was always so open with me. But this time, he wasn't. The next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling. I would sit at the kitchen table, staring out the window, wondering if he was telling the truth, if there was someone else. Or was I just being foolish, caught up in insecurities I had never noticed before? I kept telling myself that everything was fine, that I was just being paranoid. But as the days went on, my doubts grew. And when something like that enters your mind, it doesn't leave. A week passed, and my anxiety only deepened. I started noticing other things, small details I had never paid attention to before. His phone, for one. He always kept it close by, his screen face down when he wasn't using it. That wasn't unusual. He was a private person, after all. But lately, it seemed like he was more protective of it. Every time I reached for it to check the time, he'd quickly grab it or move it away from me. It wasn't like him. He had nothing to hide, or so I thought. One afternoon, I saw his phone on the coffee table while he was in the shower. Without thinking, I picked it up. I justified it to myself as just checking the time, though I knew that wasn't true. I opened the lock screen, my fingers trembling, and I scrolled through his messages. I knew I shouldn't, but the curiosity had consumed me. There was nothing alarming at first. Text from work, from friends, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, my eyes froze. There were several transactions, large amounts of money being transferred to someone, not to a company or a service, but to an individual. The sums were hefty, repeated every month. Who was he sending this money to? I didn't recognize the name. It was a woman's name, someone I had never heard of before. And the transfers weren't small. They were significant. My heart raced as I stared at the screen, my thoughts spiraling. What did this mean? I had so many questions, so many scenarios running through my head, but none of them made sense. He had always been so careful with money. He was financially responsible, almost to a fault. So why was he sending such large amounts to someone I didn't know? When he came out of the shower, I put the phone back on the table, trying to act normal, though my hands were shaking. He noticed. "Everything okay?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly as he stepped closer to me. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just a little tired." It was a lie, but I had to hold it together. I wasn't ready to confront him yet, not until I knew the whole truth. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, my mind racing. I had to know more. I had to understand what was happening, and that meant I had to follow him. I needed to see for myself what was going on, even if it meant risking everything. The next morning, I couldn't shake the restlessness in my chest. My mind kept replaying the scene with his phone, the strange transactions, the unanswered questions. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't just wait for him to explain. So, I did something drastic. I decided to follow him. He didn't know I was watching, of course. I told myself it was for closure, that I needed to see the truth with my own eyes. But even as I followed him that afternoon, something in me felt sick, like I was crossing a line I'd never be able to uncross. He left the house earlier than usual, his briefcase in hand. He seemed distracted, preoccupied, and that only made my suspicions grow. I waited a few minutes before I slipped out of the house, keeping a safe distance between us. I had to be careful. I couldn't afford to get caught. Not yet. He drove toward the upscale part of town, an area I'd never really had a reason to visit. Expensive cars lined the streets, the kind of place where people who didn't need to worry about money lived. I couldn't imagine why he would be heading there. It wasn't like he had clients in that neighborhood. He always worked from home or the office. I kept a few cars behind him, trying to keep my breathing steady. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought for sure he'd hear it if he turned around. The further he drove, the more questions I had. Was he meeting someone? Was this about work? Or was it something else? I had no idea what to expect, but a part of me already knew, deep down, that this wasn't going to end well. He pulled into a driveway, and I parked a block away, staying out of sight. I watched as he got out of the car and walked up to a large, beautiful house. It was old and well-maintained, the kind of home you see in magazines, lavish, elegant, out of reach for someone like me. He rang the doorbell, and an elderly woman opened the door almost immediately, as if she had been waiting for him. They exchanged a hug. It looked like an affectionate greeting, but there was something about the way they stood so close, the way her hand lingered on his back, that made my stomach churn. She smiled up at him, and he returned the gesture, but there was something different in the way he looked at her. A familiarity, a comfort. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Was this just a friendly visit? Maybe, but something inside me told me that was a lie. The way he stood there, relaxed and unguarded, didn't seem like a business meeting. The way she touched him, it was intimate in a way I hadn't seen between us in years. My mind was reeling, but I couldn't look away. The door closed behind him, and I stayed there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just some colleague or family friend. It was something more. The truth was slipping through my fingers, like sand, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend not to see it. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, the weight of what I had just witnessed settling in. I couldn't stop shaking. What was he doing? Why had he been so secretive? And why hadn't he ever mentioned her? There was so much I didn't understand, so many pieces missing from the puzzle. But the image of them standing so close, the way they interacted, it was burned into my mind. It wasn't a casual greeting. It was something more. And that's when I realized I was dealing with something far bigger than I had ever imagined. I knew I had to go back, confront him, but I couldn't bring myself to do it just yet. What would I say? How could I even begin to explain what I had seen? What if I was wrong? What if it was just innocent, like he had said? I hated myself for doubting him, but the doubts were growing, and they couldn't be ignored any longer. I went home, trying to act as normal as possible. He was already back, sitting in the living room, flipping through a magazine like nothing had changed. Like everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. Not anymore. I could see it in his eyes, the way his gaze flickered away from mine whenever I looked at him. He was hiding something. And now, I had proof. He smiled when he saw me, but it didn't reach his eyes. "How was your day?" he asked casually, but the question felt hollow. I could tell he was nervous. And for the first time in years, I was too. "I saw you today," I said, my voice cold, my words coming out before I could stop them. "I saw you with her." His expression faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. I didn't need him to say anything. The truth was written all over his face. He stood there, frozen for a second, like he had been caught in a lie too big to cover up. His face flushed, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. He was trying to find the right words, but they weren't coming. I didn't need him to explain. I could feel the truth simmering beneath the surface. The truth that I had been denying, convincing myself was just a series of coincidences, a chain of misunderstandings. I crossed my arms over my chest, my gaze unwavering. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice trembling. Not with fear, but with a deep, growing anger. What's going on, Dan? He took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to speak. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. I waited, each second stretching out, suffocating the space between us. The silence was deafening. I wasn't going to tell you, he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. But I guess I don't have a choice now. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. I waited for him to continue, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to hear it. I needed him to explain everything, even if I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. She's an old friend of mine, he began, his eyes darting to the floor. Actually, no, she's more than that. I didn't want you to find out like this. I didn't interrupt. I just stood there, trying to make sense of his words, trying to understand why he had kept this secret for so long. It's not what you think, he continued, the guilt in his eyes now palpable. She and her husband, well, they've been helping me in a way. I didn't want you to feel like you weren't enough, like you weren't giving me what I needed. So, I kept it hidden. I felt my heart drop. His words were cryptic, confusing. I had no idea what he meant by helping me, but it didn't sound good. What does that mean, Dan? What kind of help? His hands trembled as he ran them through his hair. They've been giving me what I've been missing. What you can't give me. I felt my stomach twist. The words, though vague, painted a picture I wasn't ready to see. What was he talking about? What could they be giving him that I wasn't? They've been supporting me, he said, finally meeting my gaze. In every way. They've been paying me for my company. I've been their toy boy. The room spun. His confession hit me like a tidal wave, sweeping away all the stability I had built my life on. I couldn't breathe. His eyes searched mine for some sign of understanding, but all I felt was a mix of betrayal and confusion. You? What? I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. You've been with them? He nodded, his face filled with shame. It's not what you think. It's not about love. It was just a way to get by. They needed me, and I needed the money. I didn't want you to find out. I didn't want you to think less of me. I felt a cold wave wash over me. He had been keeping a part of himself hidden for so long, and now it was all coming out. But his words didn't make sense. How could he have kept this from me? How could he have been with them, an older couple, while I had been completely in the dark? I struggled to hold my emotions together. The betrayal, the confusion, the hurt, it all bubbled up inside of me, threatening to break free. But I couldn't show him that. Not yet. So you've been sleeping with him? I asked, my voice a mix of disbelief and anger. For money? For their support? He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. Yes, he admitted softly. I'm sorry. I never meant for it to get this far. It just happened. The tears I had been holding back finally started to fall. I wiped them away quickly, refusing to let him see how deeply this cut me. He had been lying to me all this time, keeping something so intimate, so personal, a secret. And now, here I was, standing in front of him, trying to process it all. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice shaking. Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me the truth? I was ashamed, he whispered. I didn't want you to think I wasn't enough for you, or that I was betraying you in some way. I thought if I kept it hidden, everything would stay normal. Normal? This wasn't normal. Nothing about this was normal. And now, everything I thought I knew about him, about us, was shattered. I stood there, feeling the weight of his confession pressing down on me, suffocating me with its implications. Every word he said felt like a dagger, twisting deeper into my heart. I wanted to scream, to hit something, to do anything to make the pain go away. But all I could do was stand there, my legs shaking, my mind racing. Do you love them? The question slipped out before I could stop it, my voice barely above a whisper. He flinched at the question, but didn't answer immediately. The silence between us felt unbearable, like the air itself had turned heavy, thick with unsaid things. Finally, he spoke, but his words didn't bring me any comfort. No, he said, his voice low. I don't love them. I never did. It was just a way out, a way to feel wanted, to feel needed. I felt a rush of nausea, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. And me? Do you still love me? My voice cracked on the last word. It felt like I was breaking apart, and I needed to hear him say it. I needed him to assure me that he hadn't completely abandoned me for them. I do, he said, his eyes finally meeting mine. I do love you, but I made a mistake. A huge mistake. And I'm so sorry. But was it enough? Could I forgive him? Could I look at him the same way again, knowing what he had done behind my back? How could I trust him after all the lies? I need time, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I need to think. I need to figure out what this means. What we are now. He nodded, his face pale, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own guilt. I understand. Take all the time you need. But as I turned away, I couldn't help but wonder, was it too late for us? Was there any coming back from this? I didn't know what to do next. My mind felt like a whirlwind of confusion, betrayal, and hurt. I had to get away, to breathe, to escape from the suffocating atmosphere in the house. So, I grabbed my purse and walked out, the cool air outside offering me some relief. I didn't have a destination in mind, just somewhere far from him, far from the weight of his confession. I drove aimlessly, my hands gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white. The world around me was moving, but I felt frozen, stuck in a moment that I couldn't escape. The thought of him with them, of him being someone else's toy, was haunting me. How could he have done this? How could he have kept it hidden for so long? I didn't recognize him anymore. I pulled into a park, parking by the lake. The water reflected the gray sky, calm and still, much like I felt inside. I needed to think. I needed to process everything. I sat there for what felt like hours, my thoughts swirling, each one more painful than the last. What did this mean for us? Could I ever look at him the same way again? Could I trust him? Was it even possible to rebuild after something like this? I reached for my phone, almost instinctively, but stopped before I could dial his number. I wasn't ready to talk to him yet. I didn't know what I'd say. Instead, I sent a message to my best friend, Sarah. She always knew what to say, even when I didn't. I need to talk. Can you meet me? Within minutes, she replied, offering to meet me at the cafe down the street. I agreed, relieved to have someone to talk to. I needed her more than ever right now. When I arrived at the cafe, Sarah was already there, waiting for me. She looked up from her phone when I walked in, her face immediately softening when she saw the expression on mine. "Hey," she said gently, standing up to give me a hug. "What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't answer immediately. I sat down, my hands trembling as I wrapped them around a cup of coffee. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and then I told her everything. I didn't hold back. I didn't leave anything out. The secret life he had been leading. The older couple. His role as their toy boy. How he had kept it from me all this time. Sarah listened, her face shifting from concern to shock to disbelief as I spoke. When I finished, there was a long silence between us. She didn't speak right away, as if processing what I had just shared. Finally, she spoke. "God, I'm so sorry. That's a lot. I don't even know what to say." "I don't either," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I feel like I don't know him anymore. I don't know what's real and what's not. How could he do this to me?" "I don't know," Sarah said softly, "but you have to decide what you want. Do you want to try to work this out? Or is this something you can't get past?" I stared at my coffee, my mind racing. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what the future held, or if we even had one anymore. But for the first time, I realized that I couldn't just let this slide. I couldn't just pretend everything was fine. I had to face the truth. And the truth was, I had to decide if I could ever trust him again. The next few days passed in a blur of confusion and uncertainty. I couldn't stop thinking about what Sarah had said. What did I want? What did I need? Could I even look at him without seeing the man who had lied to me, who had kept a part of himself hidden in the shadows? Dan tried to talk to me several times, but I couldn't bring myself to listen. Each time he spoke, it felt like a betrayal all over again. I wasn't ready to hear his explanations or his apologies. I needed space. I needed time. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when an email notification popped up. It was from Dan. I hadn't checked my email in days, but something about the subject line caught my attention. Subject, I owe you the truth. My heart raced as I clicked on it. His words spilled out onto the screen, raw and unfiltered. I'm sorry for everything. For lying, for hiding things from you, for making you feel like you couldn't trust me. I know I've hurt you beyond words. I never meant to, but I also never imagined you'd find out the way you did. I thought I could keep it hidden, but now I see how wrong I was. He went on to explain more about his relationship with the couple. He admitted that it had started out as a financial arrangement, but over time, it had become something more, something he couldn't quite describe. He said it had never been about love or romance, but about the comfort and validation he received from them. They made him feel seen, wanted, in a way he hadn't felt in years. I know it doesn't make sense, he wrote. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to understand that I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to lie to you. I sat there, staring at the screen, my emotions churning. I didn't know what to feel. His words were sincere, but they didn't undo the damage. They didn't change the fact that he had lied to me, that he had kept this hidden, and that he had allowed me to live in the dark while he was living a double life. But part of me, deep down, knew that there was still something left. A piece of me still loved him. A part of me wanted to believe that we could work through this, that somehow we could rebuild what we had lost. I didn't reply immediately. I couldn't. But his words stayed with me, and I knew the time had come to make a choice. I didn't respond to Dan's email right away. Instead, I spent the next few days in a haze, replaying everything in my mind. The lies, the betrayal, the man I thought I knew. I kept thinking about what Sarah had said. I needed to decide what I wanted. But how could I make that decision? How could I choose between the man I loved and the man he had become? Every conversation I had with him seemed like a battle between my heart and my head. My heart still ached for him, for the man who had once been my best friend, my partner. But my head told me that I couldn't just forget what he had done. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Dan tried reaching out to me again. I could tell he was desperate for me to understand, for me to forgive him. But each time I saw his name pop up on my phone, a wave of frustration and sadness washed over me. He had broken my trust in a way that felt impossible to repair. One evening, I decided to sit down and have an honest conversation with him. I couldn't keep running from the truth, no matter how painful it was. I needed closure, or at least the chance to decide whether this relationship was worth saving. When I walked into the living room, Dan was sitting on the couch, his face drawn with exhaustion. He looked up when he saw me, his eyes pleading. Can we talk? I asked, my voice shaky. Really talk? He nodded, silently, and I took a seat across from him. The tension in the room was palpable. I could feel the weight of everything that had been said, everything that hadn't been said. It was suffocating. I've been thinking a lot, I began, choosing my words carefully. About what you told me. About everything. And I need you to understand something, Dan. I paused, taking a deep breath. I don't know if I can forgive you. His face fell, but he didn't interrupt. He let me speak, let me voice my pain. Everything we've built, everything I thought was real, has been tainted. I can't just pretend like nothing happened. I paused, the words catching in my throat. You kept a part of yourself hidden from me for so long. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Dan's eyes filled with regret, and for a moment, I saw the man I once loved. The one who had been honest and open with me. The one who had been my rock. But even that image couldn't undo the damage. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to lose you. I shook my head, the tears threatening to fall. I don't know what I want anymore. I'm so lost, Dan. So lost. The following days were filled with silence between us. It was like we were both waiting for something to shift, for some sign that things could get better. But nothing changed. We still slept in the same bed, but the space between us felt like an ocean. Every touch, every glance, felt strained, uncomfortable. It wasn't just the secrets that were keeping us apart. It was the weight of everything that had been said, the guilt, the shame. I couldn't stop thinking about what Dan had told me about the couple, how they had been there for him in ways that I didn't know how to. I had always believed that love was enough, that trust and honesty were the foundations of any relationship. But now, it felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling, and I had no idea how to rebuild. One night, as we sat down for dinner, I couldn't take the silence anymore. "Dan," I said, my voice low, "do you love them?" The question had been eating at me for days. I needed to know the truth. I needed to understand what he had felt for them, if anything. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't love them. I never did." I could see the sincerity in his eyes, but the pain in his voice told me that the damage had already been done. "Then why?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "Why did you let it go on for so long?" He looked down, his fingers tracing the edge of his plate. "I don't know," he admitted. "I was lost. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you, but I didn't know how to stop. They gave me something I didn't even know I needed, and I got caught up in it." I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. How could he have let it go on for so long? How could he have betrayed me like that? "I can't keep living like this, Dan," I said softly. "I can't keep pretending like everything is fine. I need to figure out what to do." The days that followed were filled with a quiet kind of tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both just going through the motions, pretending that things could ever go back to the way they were. I kept replaying our conversation in my head, trying to make sense of everything he had said, trying to decide whether I could forgive him. I spent more time out of the house, trying to clear my head. I went for long walks, talked to friends, did everything I could to avoid the suffocating atmosphere that had taken over our home. Dan tried to reach out to me again, but each time, I felt more and more distant from him. The truth had come out, and now there was no going back. One afternoon, Sarah called me. "You're avoiding him," she said, her voice sharp with concern. "You're shutting him out." "I don't know how to face him anymore," I admitted. "I don't know how to trust him after everything." "You have to decide, though," she said. "You can't keep living in this limbo. Either you let him in and try to rebuild, or you walk away. But you need to make a choice." Her words hit me harder than I expected. She was right. I couldn't keep running from this. I needed to decide what I wanted for myself, for my future. The next evening, I sat down with Dan again. This time, I didn't feel the need to ask him for any more explanations. I just needed to ask myself one question. Was I willing to fight for us? Was I willing to forgive him and try to rebuild? Or was this the end? I found myself standing at a crossroads. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the lies, the confusion, felt heavier than I could carry. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of what had happened. I couldn't keep waiting for things to go back to the way they were, because I knew they never would. That night, I sat across from Dan, my heart racing as I tried to gather my thoughts. His eyes were filled with uncertainty, and for the first time, I saw how much he was hurting. "Dan," I said, my voice steady, "I can't make any promises, but I think I'm ready to try, to work through this. But only if you're willing to be completely honest from now on. No more secrets. No more lies." He nodded, his face filled with relief. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'll prove to you that I can be the man you deserve." I didn't know where this would lead, or if we could ever truly rebuild what we had. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was taking control of my own life. And that, I realized, was the first step toward healing. I spent the next few days reflecting on what had happened. It wasn't easy. It wasn't like flipping a switch, but I had made the decision to try, to give him a chance to make things right. But even as I tried to open up to him, the doubts kept creeping in. Was I just fooling myself? Could I ever really trust him again? Dan, for his part, was doing everything he could to show me that he was sincere. He was more open than I had ever seen him, answering my questions without hesitation. He was patient, listening to my fears and doubts, never rushing me, never pushing me to forgive him before I was ready. It was a strange feeling, like I was walking on fragile ground, unsure if it would hold. But I also realized that there was no perfect answer. Relationships weren't easy. They weren't simple, but sometimes they were worth fighting for. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, things started to shift. It wasn't a miracle, but it was progress. We began to talk more openly about everything. The mistakes, the hurt, the uncertainty. It was raw, it was messy, but it was also healing. I could see the effort Dan was putting in. He was showing up, being present, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like he was truly trying to be the person I needed. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the pain would resurface, but we were learning to navigate them together. And in the quiet moments, when I looked at him, I could see a glimmer of the man I once loved. It was a small glimmer, but it was enough. Know what the future held, but I knew that I couldn't walk away just yet. There was something still there between us, something worth fighting for, even if it felt like a battle at times. Dan continued to prove himself, though not in grand gestures, but in small ways. The way he looked at me with regret, the way he asked about my day, the way he held me a little longer when we hugged. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. I still had a lot of questions, a lot of fears, but as we worked through them together, I realized something. The man I had married wasn't gone. He was still there, but he had made mistakes. And maybe, just maybe, those mistakes didn't have to define our future. There were still moments when the past felt too fresh, when the weight of what had happened threatened to crush me. But Dan was there, holding my hand, letting me cry, and never once making me feel like I was alone in this. We weren't fixed. We weren't perfect, but we were trying. And in the end, that was all I could ask for. Months passed, and life slowly began to return to some semblance of normalcy. The pain, the betrayal, the doubts, they were still there, lurking beneath the surface. But they weren't the only things that defined our relationship anymore. We had started rebuilding, brick by brick, even though we both knew it would take time. I started to trust him again, not fully, but in small ways. He wasn't perfect, and I didn't expect him to be. He was human, just like me. And while we had a long road ahead of us, the fact that we were both willing to put in the effort made me believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. There were times when I would catch myself thinking about the couple, wondering if Dan would ever go back to them, or if that part of his life was really over. I had no answers, but I realized that the only thing I could control was my own heart, my own choices. And I chose to stay, to give him a chance, to give us a chance. It wasn't easy. It wasn't smooth, but it was real, and that was enough. One evening, Dan and I sat down together, no distractions, no outside pressures. I could feel the weight of everything that had happened between us, and I knew we needed to have a conversation. One that would clear the air once and for all. Do you ever think about them? I asked, my voice steady but filled with curiosity. The couple, do they still have a hold on you? Dan was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but filled with emotion. No, he said quietly, they don't have a hold on me anymore. I was lost back then. I thought I needed them, but I don't anymore. I could feel a weight lift off my chest. I hadn't realized how much that question had been eating at me, how much uncertainty I had been carrying. It was a simple answer, but it was all I needed to hear. I'm sorry, he added, his voice thick with sincerity. I never should have let it get to that point. I should have been honest with you from the start. I nodded, my throat tight. I know, but I'm here, trying to move forward. We both are. We sat in silence for a while, just letting the words hang in the air. The past still haunted us, but we had come to a place where we could talk about it, where we could both be honest about our fears and hopes for the future. And that, for now, was enough. It had been months since that first conversation, and while the scars of the past hadn't faded, they had become easier to live with. We were learning to be real with each other, to face the hard truths instead of running from them. There were still moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if we would ever fully heal, but I also realized that healing wasn't linear. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it. Dan was doing his best. He was present. He was working on himself, and most importantly, he was trying to be the partner I needed him to be. And that, I realized, was all I could ask for. As for me, I was starting to find peace in the uncertainty. The future was still unknown, but I knew that I was no longer holding on to the past. I had to let go of the idea that everything would be perfect because perfection didn't exist. What mattered now was that we were moving forward together, one day at a time. The relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real. We had worked through the hardest parts, and while there were still some lingering doubts, there was also something else, hope. It was a quiet hope, a slow-burning light that told me maybe, just maybe, things could be okay again. We didn't have all the answers, but we had each other, and that was a good place to start. There would still be struggles, there would still be pain, but we were ready to face it all together. I couldn't predict the future, but I could see a future. One where we worked through the mess, one where we learned to trust again. And for now, that was enough. We were building something new, something different, and I was willing to see where it would take us. Because even in the mess of it all, I believed in us. It was late one night, and we were sitting on the couch, wrapped up in a blanket, when Dan turned to me with a soft smile. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving us a chance." I looked at him, my heart full of conflicting emotions. But there was something else, too. Peace. "Thank you," I replied, my voice soft but sure, "for showing up." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we were going to be okay. As the weeks went on, the tension in our home began to ease. It wasn't a dramatic shift. There were no grand declarations, no life-changing moments. It was subtle, a change in the way we looked at each other, in the way we spoke, in the small things we did. I began to trust him again, not fully, but in ways I hadn't thought possible just months before. We were still a work in progress, but I could feel a slow rebuilding. The emotional distance that had once felt insurmountable was starting to close, inch by inch. I didn't expect everything to be perfect, but I could see now that it wasn't about perfection. It was about effort, and we were both putting in the work. Dan seemed to sense the change in me. He was more attentive, more present, and although he never said it directly, I could feel his remorse in the way he tried to make things right. It was the quiet moments, the way he reached for my hand when we sat together, the way he looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time again, that showed me his sincerity. I still had my moments of doubt, of course. The past wasn't something that could be easily erased. But there was also a new kind of hope, something I hadn't felt in a long time. And that hope, small as it was enough for me to keep moving forward, one step at a time. One evening, we sat together, a glass of wine in hand, and the conversation turned to the future. I wasn't sure where it would take us, but the fact that we were even talking about it together felt like a step in the right direction. "I don't know what the future holds," Dan said, his voice soft, "but I know I want to be here, with you. No more secrets. No more lies." His words felt like a balm to my soul. I had feared that he might be lying to me again, that we were just going through the motions, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. But the sincerity in his eyes, the raw honesty in his voice, it made me believe him, even if only for that moment. "I want that too," I replied, my voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want to move forward with you, even if it's not easy." There was a long pause, and then Dan leaned in and kissed me gently on the forehead. "We'll take it slow," he whispered, "one day at a time." And in that moment, I believed him. We didn't have all the answers, and we probably never would. But we had each other, and that was enough for now. As we navigated our new normal, there were still bumps along the way. It wasn't a fairy tale, and it wasn't smooth sailing. There were days when I questioned whether I was making the right choice, days when I wondered if we could ever truly heal. But there were also days when I looked at Dan and saw the man I had married, the man I had fallen in love with. We had our ups and downs, of course. There were arguments, moments of doubt, and the occasional tear-filled night. But with each passing day, we learned how to communicate better, how to navigate our differences, and how to be honest with each other. Dan, in his own quiet way, began to rebuild the trust one had lost in him. He didn't try to fix everything at once, but he showed up. He was there, and that was more than I could have hoped for. And I realized that maybe the road to healing wasn't as long as I had once believed. It wasn't going to be perfect, but it could be enough. We could be enough. As the months turned into a year, I began to notice small changes in myself. I was more at peace, more content with the present moment, even though the past still had a way of creeping up on me. But I had learned something important over the past year. Healing wasn't linear. Some days would be harder than others, but that didn't mean I hadn't made progress. Dan and I had our share of struggles, but we also had moments of real connection, moments that made me believe in us again. It wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always comfortable, but it was real. And that, I realized, was what mattered the most. We weren't perfect, but we were trying. And that, in itself, was a victory. One day, as we sat together on the couch, Dan looked at me with a kind of tenderness that caught me off guard. "I know things haven't been easy," he said quietly, "but I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, and I'm ready to keep fighting for us." His words felt like a promise that, even in the hardest of times, we wouldn't give up. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: hope. It was a quiet hope, the kind that whispers rather than shouts. But it was enough. Enough to keep moving forward. Enough to believe that we could heal. A few months had passed since our conversation on the couch, and things were beginning to settle into a rhythm. Dan and I weren't perfect, but we had learned how to be honest with each other, how to speak openly about our fears, and how to embrace the imperfections that made us human. Our relationship had grown stronger, not despite our struggles, but because of them. There were still tough days, of course. Days when the past seemed to loom over us like a shadow, when I questioned whether we were truly moving forward or just treading water. But as time went on, I began to see a new side of Dan, the side that had been buried beneath all the mistakes, the lies, and the regrets. He was trying, and that was something I hadn't seen in him before. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Dan turned to me with a serious expression. "I want to talk about the future," he said, his voice steady. I felt a lump form in my throat. The future. It was a word that still made me nervous, still brought up so many doubts. But I nodded, willing to hear him out. "I know I've made mistakes," he continued, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right, to build a future with you. I know I've hurt you, and I can't take that back. But I can keep showing you, every day, that I'm here, and that I want this." His words were simple, but they meant the world to me. There was no guarantee, no promise that we would never face hardships again. But there was a new kind of trust, a new kind of understanding between us. And that was enough for me. "I want that too," I replied softly, my voice filled with the raw honesty that had come to define our relationship. "I want to move forward with you. Together." We began to make plans for the future, little ones at first. Weekend getaways, dinners with friends, quiet nights at home. We started to embrace the simple joys of life, the kind of things that hadn't felt possible when the weight of the past was constantly hanging over us. But with every plan we made, there was an underlying sense of hope. It wasn't something that would fix everything overnight, but it was a step in the right direction. We were choosing to move forward, choosing to rebuild. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, Dan turned to me with a mischievous grin. "What do you think about going away for a weekend next month?" he asked, his eyes sparkling with excitement. I smiled, feeling the warmth of his words. "I think that sounds perfect." And just like that, we had our first real plan for the future. It wasn't grand or life-changing, but it was a sign that we were both ready to embrace what came next, to take the next step together. It wasn't long before we went on our weekend getaway, just the two of us. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a cozy cabin in the mountains, away from the noise of the world. But it was exactly what we needed. Time to reconnect, to remember who we were before everything had fallen apart. As we spent the weekend hiking, cooking meals together, and laughing at silly jokes, I began to realize something. We had come so far. The weight of the past had not disappeared, but it no longer defined us. We were building something new, something that was ours, and I was starting to believe that it could work. On our last night there, we sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, looking at the stars. The cool mountain air filled my lungs, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. "I never thought I'd be here with you," I said quietly, my voice filled with awe. Dan reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But I'm glad we're here. Together." And in that moment, I knew we were ready to face whatever came next, together. Back home, life resumed its usual pace. but something had shifted. There was a new sense of peace between us, a sense of balance that hadn't been there before. We had our moments, of course, times when doubts crept in, when the old wounds still stung. But we were learning how to navigate those moments, how to lean on each other for support instead of allowing the past to drag us down. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, Dan turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "I know things haven't been easy," he said quietly, "but I want you to know something. I'm not just here because I feel like I have to be. I'm here because I want to be. I'm choosing you. Every day." His words were simple, but they meant more than I could express. In that moment, I realized that we were no longer holding on to the past, no longer letting it define us. We were moving forward, and that was enough. "I'm choosing you too," I whispered, my heart full. And for the first time in a long time, I truly believed it. The months continued to pass, each one bringing us closer to a new chapter in our lives. The past still lingered, but it no longer held the power it once had. We had built something new, something strong, and we were both willing to keep fighting for it. Dan and I had our first real argument in months one evening, and it wasn't easy. There were tears, raised voices, and moments of doubt. But when the dust settled, we talked, really talked. We communicated in a way we hadn't before, without secrets, without walls between us. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And as we sat there, exhausted but stronger for it, I realized something important. Relationships weren't about avoiding conflict. They were about how you handled it when it came. And we were handling it together. One afternoon, as we sat in the kitchen preparing dinner, I noticed how different it felt to be with Dan now. There was no lingering tension, no undercurrent of unspoken words hanging between us. It was easy, comfortable, the way it had been before everything unraveled. We'd come so far from the days of secrecy and confusion, and I couldn't help but smile as I watched him chop vegetables with a focus I admired. There was a quiet joy in these simple moments, something I hadn't appreciated enough before, but now I treasured them. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" I asked, leaning against the counter, watching him. Dan looked up from his work, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "I do. Every day. And I'm grateful. Grateful for us." His words struck me in a way I didn't expect. There had been times when I doubted we would ever get here, times when I thought the damage was too deep, but we had made it. We had found our way back to each other. "I'm grateful too," I said quietly, the weight of the past no longer a burden, but something that had shaped us into who we were now. Life had a way of testing us, of throwing curveballs when we least expected them, but we were learning how to handle those tests together. Dan had started therapy to work on his past, on the mistakes he had made, and I had started to do the same. It wasn't always easy, but it was necessary. I watched him grow, day by day, into someone who wasn't defined by his past, but who was using it to become better. And I realized that I was doing the same. We weren't perfect, but we were trying. We were healing, slowly but surely. One evening, after our therapy session, we sat on the couch in silence for a while. I didn't know what to say. There were no grand conclusions, no final answers. But as I looked at Dan, I realized that we were both stronger for it. "You've come a long way," I said finally, my voice soft but filled with pride. Dan smiled, but there was a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. "So have you." And in that moment, I knew we were both on the path to becoming the best versions of ourselves, not just for each other, but for us. The holidays were approaching, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement for the first time in years. Last year had been a blur of pain, but this year felt different. We were planning to spend Christmas with my family, and the thought of being together, surrounded by love and laughter, filled me with hope. As we decorated the tree one evening, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The memories of the dark days seemed distant now, fading into the background as we created new ones. Dan was no longer the man I feared he had become. He was someone I trusted, someone I loved deeply, and that trust had been earned, bit by bit. Dan reached for a box of ornaments, handing me the delicate glass ball we'd bought the year we first moved in together. "Remember this?" he asked, his voice warm with nostalgia. I smiled, taking the ornament from his hand. "Of course I do. It's one of my favorites." We've come a long way since then, he said, his eyes meeting mine with a tenderness that took my breath away. I nodded, my heart swelling with emotion. We have. Christmas was everything I had hoped for. Surrounded by family, by laughter, by love. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. Dan and I spent the day exchanging small, thoughtful gifts, each one a symbol of the effort we had both put into our relationship. As the night drew to a close, we found ourselves alone on the porch, watching the stars. It was a quiet moment, but one I would treasure forever. We had been through so much, but here we were, together, stronger than ever. I never thought we'd make it here, I said softly, my breath visible in the cold night air. Dan looked at me, his expression full of emotion. Neither did I. But I'm so glad we did. And in that moment, I realized that while our journey had been long and painful, it had also been beautiful in its own way. We had rebuilt something together, something stronger than before. I love you, I whispered, the words flowing from my heart without hesitation. Dan smiled, pulling me close. I love you too. More than anything. The months after Christmas were filled with new beginnings. Dan and I had learned to navigate life together with a new sense of understanding, a new kind of bond that was built on honesty, respect, and love. We were still working on ourselves, still healing, but we were doing it together. One evening, as we sat in the living room, our hands intertwined, Dan looked at me with a serious expression. I've been thinking a lot about the future lately, he said. About us. And I know I've made a lot of mistakes, but I want you to know something. I'm never going to stop trying. His words hit me like a wave. There was something so genuine, so raw about them, that I couldn't help but believe him. We had been through the worst, and now, we were finally starting to see the light. I'm not going anywhere, I said softly, my heart full of conviction. I'm here, with you, and I always will be. And in that moment, I knew we had built something worth fighting for. Together. It had been a few months since that quiet evening on the porch, and the more time passed, the more I realized how much I had grown. Dan and I had become more attuned to each other, understanding when to offer support and when to give space. It wasn't perfect, life never was, but it felt real. One afternoon, we were having coffee in the kitchen when Dan brought up something I had been avoiding thinking about. What do you think about moving? He asked casually, but I could tell there was more behind the question. I put my mug down, feeling a surge of uncertainty. Moving? Where to? A fresh start. Somewhere new, he said, his voice tentative. I know we've rebuilt here, but I can't help but wonder if we need a change of scenery. A place to make our new memories, you know? The thought of leaving the town we had lived in for so long stirred up something inside me. Could we really start over completely? The idea was both exciting and terrifying. But as I looked into Dan's eyes, I saw that same hope I had seen so many times before. The hope that we could leave the past behind us and move forward. I don't know, I said, my voice soft. It's a big decision. We don't have to do it right away, he reassured me. Just something to think about. I sat back, contemplating his words. A fresh start. It could be just what we needed, but there was so much fear of the unknown. Could we really leave everything behind? But maybe, just maybe, it would give us the space we needed to grow even further. Over the next few weeks, Dan and I discussed the idea of moving more seriously. We researched different cities, weighed the pros and cons, and imagined what life could look like in a new place. The idea of starting over was both thrilling and overwhelming. But the more we talked about it, the more I realized that it wasn't just about the physical place. It was about creating the next chapter of our lives together. One night, after a long conversation about the possibilities, I realized how far we had come from the couple that once struggled to communicate. Now, we were actively planning our future, dreaming together. It felt like we were building something new from the ground up, and I couldn't help but feel hopeful. We'll make it work, no matter where we go, I said, my voice firm with conviction. Dan smiled, his eyes lighting up. I believe that. We've made it this far. We can make it through anything. The thought of starting fresh, away from the memories of the past, felt like a gift we had earned. And the idea of doing it with Dan by my side made it all the more exciting. As the days went by, The decision to move felt more and more like the right one. We visited a few cities, toured neighborhoods, and talked to locals about what life would be like in each place. It was exhilarating, this sense of possibility. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of control over our future, over what was next for us. On one of our visits to a city we were seriously considering, we found a charming house on the outskirts, surrounded by trees and fields. It wasn't too far from the city, but it offered the peace and solitude we had been craving. It felt like it could be ours. "We could make this home," Dan said, his voice filled with awe as he looked out at the property. I nodded, a smile tugging at my lips. "I think so, too." It was a huge step, one that felt almost surreal. But there was something about this house, this place, that made it feel like the beginning of something beautiful. Once we made the decision to move, everything seemed to fall into place. We put our house on the market, packed our belongings, and began to say goodbye to the life we had built here. It was bittersweet. There were memories tied to every corner, every street. But at the same time, there was a sense of excitement in the air, as if we were stepping into a new adventure together. On our last night in the old house, we stood in the empty living room, our hands clasped together. It was quiet, peaceful, and full of potential. "We're doing this," I whispered, my voice filled with awe. Dan turned to me, his face a mixture of excitement and nostalgia. "We are. And I'm so glad it's with you." In that moment, I realized how much we had truly healed. This wasn't just about moving to a new city or a new house. It was about the journey we had taken together, the struggles we had faced, and the love we had rebuilt. We had come so far, and the future was waiting for us with open arms. The days that followed our move were filled with new challenges and adjustments. There was the stress of unpacking, getting settled into a new routine, and learning our way around a completely different city. But there was also something invigorating about it, the sense that we were writing a new story for ourselves. We spent weekends exploring our new neighborhood, meeting new people, and finding new places to enjoy. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were moments when I missed the comfort of familiarity, when I questioned whether we had made the right choice. But those moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the excitement of what we were building together. One evening, as we sat in the backyard of our new home, watching the sunset, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we had come. There had been times when I thought we wouldn't make it, times when I thought our past would always haunt us. But here we were, standing at the threshold of something new, something beautiful. "We did it," I said quietly, my voice filled with wonder. Dan turned to me, his smile full of love and pride. "Yes, we did. And we'll keep doing it." And as I looked at the life we had created, I realized that no matter what came next, we were ready for it. Together, as we settled into our new life, I began to notice the small things that made this place feel like home. The way the morning sun streamed through the windows, the soft hum of the city in the distance, and the scent of fresh flowers in the garden we had planted together. It was peaceful here, just the two of us, building something new and real. Dan seemed different, too. He was more present, more content. I could see the way he enjoyed the quiet moments with me, the way he would laugh at little jokes, the way his eyes sparkled when we talked about the future. It was as if we had both let go of the weight we had carried for so long, and the freedom was liberating. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Dan turned to me with a serious expression. "Do you ever think about the past?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with curiosity. I paused for a moment, reflecting. "I do, sometimes. But I think the past shaped us. It made us who we are now." He nodded, looking thoughtful. "Yeah, I guess I'm just glad we're here, that we made it through everything." I smiled, reaching out to hold his hand. "Me too. We're stronger because of it." It was true. The struggles, the heartache, the confusion, they had all led us here, to this new beginning. And I was ready to embrace whatever came next. A few months into our new life, we started to feel more grounded. The house was starting to look like our own, filled with memories that were ours to create. And with every passing day, I could feel our connection deepening. We had found a new rhythm, one that was peaceful and full of love. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, I noticed a change in the air. There was something different about Dan. His smile was warmer, his eyes more open, and there was a softness in his voice when he spoke to me. It was as if he had let go of all the guilt, all the weight from his past, and I could see that he was finally at peace. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said, setting down his fork and looking at me intently, "about us, and how far we've come." I put my fork down as well, my heart fluttering in anticipation. "What do you mean?" He reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "I mean, we've been through so much, and we're still here, and I don't want to take any of it for granted." His words touched me deeply. After everything we had been through, the betrayal, the pain, the heartache, we had come out on the other side stronger than ever. It was a love that had been tested and proven, and I knew it was worth fighting for. "I don't take it for granted either," I said, my voice thick with emotion. Dan smiled softly, squeezing my hand. "Good, because I never want to let you go." As time passed, we grew more and more comfortable in our new life. We had made new friends, explored new places, and found new routines. But there was still something I hadn't fully addressed, a nagging feeling that we hadn't fully let go of the past. Sure, we had moved away, started fresh, but the memories still lingered, quietly tucked away in the corners of our minds. One night, as we were lying in bed, I turned to Dan, unable to shake the feeling that something needed to be said. "Do you ever think we should talk more about everything that happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dan shifted, looking at me with a mix of concern and understanding. "You mean the past? What we went through?" I nodded. "Yeah, I know we've moved forward, but sometimes I wonder if we've really processed it all. If we've really healed." He sighed softly, running his hand through his hair. "I think about it too, but I'm not sure talking about it will change anything. We've already been through so much together." "I know," I said, "but maybe we need to truly face it. Not for anyone else, but for us. To make sure it's really behind us." Dan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Then he looked back at me, his eyes filled with something raw. "You're right. Maybe we do. But I think we're stronger now. And I think we're ready for whatever comes next." I smiled, my heart swelling with love. "Together?" "Always," he replied, his voice steady and full of certainty. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what came next, we had both found the strength to move forward, not just for each other, but for ourselves. The decision to talk about our past was one that hung over us for a few more days. But as the days passed, it became clear that we needed to address it, not because we were still trapped in the past, but because we had to fully let go in order to move on. We spent the weekend alone together, taking long walks through the park, talking about everything and nothing. But as we sat in the park on that Saturday afternoon, the conversation finally came. "I've been thinking about how much we've changed," I said, breaking the silence between us, "and how far we've come. But I still don't feel like I fully understand what you went through, what you felt back then." Dan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I didn't know how to explain it. I thought I was doing what was best at the time, but I didn't know how much it would hurt you." "I understand now," I said, my voice full of compassion, "but I still need to know why. Why it happened." He looked away, taking a deep breath. "It's complicated, but I was lost, and I didn't realize what I was doing until it was too late." We spent the rest of the afternoon talking, really talking, about everything that had happened. The hurt, the mistakes, the feelings of guilt and shame. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. By the end of the conversation, there was a sense of peace between us, an understanding that we had both carried the weight of the past for far too long, and it was time to let go. We couldn't change what had happened, but we could move forward together. And as we walked home hand in hand, I realized that this was the final piece of the puzzle. We were ready to embrace the future with all its possibilities. As the weeks passed, I began to feel a new kind of peace. We had faced the past, dealt with the unresolved feelings, and moved on. We were no longer running from our history, but embracing it as part of who we were. And that made all the difference. Dan was a new person, not perfect, but real. And I had learned to accept him for all that he was, including his mistakes. In doing so, I had learned to accept myself as well. And as we continued our journey together, I realized that this was the life we had built, a life of love, forgiveness, and hope. Together, we had found the strength to move forward. Together, we had found a new beginning. One evening, as the sky turned a soft pink and orange, Dan and I sat on the porch, reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. It was hard to believe how much had changed, how far we had come since the days of confusion and betrayal. Now, the weight of the past felt lighter, no longer a constant presence in our lives. But even as I felt this new peace, a small part of me still wondered what the future held for us. Could we truly leave everything behind and embrace the life we were building without looking back? Could we truly leave the shadows of the past where they belonged? Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't made it out? I asked quietly, my eyes on the horizon. Dan was silent for a moment, his fingers gently tracing the edge of his cup. I think about it all the time, he said. But then I think about everything we've gone through together and how we're still standing. It makes me believe we can handle whatever comes next. His words were simple, but they carried a weight of truth. He was right. We had faced the impossible, and yet here we were, stronger and more connected than ever before. The future, whatever it held, was ours to shape. I'm not afraid anymore, I said, my voice steady. Not of you, not of us. I think we've found our way. Dan smiled, a genuine smile that made his eyes light up. Me neither. And no matter what happens, I know we'll always have each other. The next few weeks were filled with small moments of joy and contentment. Our life, though far from perfect, had a rhythm now. We were rebuilding trust, not just with each other, but with ourselves. I had learned that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant accepting the past and choosing to move forward anyway. One afternoon, as we went for a walk through a nearby park, I noticed Dan was unusually quiet. He had a distant look in his eyes, and for the first time in a while, I felt a tug of uncertainty. "What's on your mind?" I asked, stopping to face him. He hesitated, looking down at the ground. "I've just been thinking about everything, how we've come so far, but there's still so much I haven't said. So much I haven't told you." My heart skipped a beat. "Dan, what do you mean?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "There are still things I haven't shared with you, things that I didn't know how to say before. But I think it's time I told you everything. All of it." I felt a pang of fear, but I held his gaze. "I'm ready to listen. Whatever it is, we can face it together." Dan nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know, but I want you to know that none of it changes how I feel about you. I need to say it." The air felt heavy between us, but I could see the sincerity in his eyes. I had learned to trust him again, and I was willing to hear whatever he had to say. That night, as we sat together in the quiet of our living room, Dan finally began to speak. His words came slowly, as though he were choosing each one carefully, but there was no hesitation in his voice. "I've always struggled with guilt," he began. "Not just about what happened with us, but with everything. I've never been able to shake it, and I thought I could hide it, that I could bury it and move on. But it kept coming back." I listened intently, my heart aching for him. He had carried this weight for so long, and now he was finally letting it out. I think I was afraid of losing you," he continued. "I never wanted to hurt you, but I was so scared that I'd lose you because of what I did. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to make it right." I reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Dan, you don't have to fix everything. We don't have to fix everything. We just need to keep moving forward." He looked at me, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I know, but I wanted you to know, because you deserve to know the truth. I've carried this guilt for so long, but now I feel like I'm finally letting it go." We sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. But it wasn't a heavy silence. It was a moment of understanding, a moment of healing. And I knew, in that moment, that we had come full circle. The past no longer held power over us. We had faced it, confronted it, and we were free to move forward, together. The days that followed felt like a continuation of the healing process. We spent more time together, focused on building the life we had dreamed of. The shadows of the past no longer loomed over us, and though the scars would always remain, They were no longer painful reminders. They were part of our story, part of the love we had built. One evening, as we were lying in bed, Dan turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I never thought we'd get here," he said, his voice quiet. "After everything we went through, I didn't think we'd ever find a way back to each other. But we did. We found a way." I smiled softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "We did, and I'm proud of us. We've come so far." Dan's eyes softened, and he pulled me closer, wrapping his arms around me. "I'm proud of us, too, and I'll never take this for granted. Never again." It was in that moment that I realized just how much we had grown, how much we had learned. Our love wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was all that mattered. The final chapter of our story wasn't about a grand gesture or a dramatic declaration. It was about the quiet moments we shared, the simple acts of love and kindness that defined our relationship. It was about the way we had learned to trust each other again, to forgive and move forward, no matter the obstacles. As we sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This was our life now. This was where we were meant to be. "I love you," Dan said softly, his voice full of sincerity. "I love you too," I replied, my heart full. And in that moment, as the world around us grew quiet, I knew that no matter what the future held, we had found our way. Together.